Welcome to Incentives Matter, your guide to what's new in behavioral science and behavioral economics. Let's see what's really driving decisions.
We often hear about the power of individual choices in tackling climate change, right? Recycle more, fly less, eat less meat. It's almost a constant drumbeat.
Absolutely. The narrative is powerful. Every small action counts, and collectively we can make a difference. It's a very appealing message, emotionally.
But a recent analysis really pushes back on that, suggesting that even if everyone adopted all recommended climate-friendly behaviors today, it would only get us about 10% of the way to the necessary emissions reductions by 2050.
That 10% figure is quite jarring. It suggests that while individual efforts are laudable, they are fundamentally insufficient to solve a problem of this scale without parallel, much larger systemic shifts. It's what the World Resources Institute, or WRI, calls the 10% illusion.
The 10% illusion. That's a stark way to frame it. For so long, the focus has been on consumer decisions, on lifestyle changes. What does this analysis identify as the core misunderstanding?
The core misunderstanding, as outlined in the WRI report, lies in where the vast majority of emissions originate. The analysis breaks it down. Approximately 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions are tied not to direct consumer behavior, but to large-scale infrastructure, industrial processes, energy production, and supply chains. Think about the emissions embedded in manufacturing cement, steel, or the electricity grid itself.
So even if someone diligently turns off all their lights and bikes to work, that's not addressing the carbon footprint of, say, the data centers powering the internet, or the ships transporting goods across oceans.
Precisely. The choices individuals make within their homes or regarding their personal transportation are just one slice of the pie. The larger, more intractable problem is the carbon intensity of the systems that provide us with housing, food, goods, and services. The paper highlights that individuals are often operating within a system that's already heavily carbon-locked. One might compare it to trying to bail out a flooded basement with a teacup while the main water line is still ruptured. The effort is sincere, but the scale of the intervention is mismatched to the problem. That analogy holds well. The WRI analysis isn't dismissing individual action entirely, but it's recontextualizing its impact. It suggests that focusing solely on individual behavior can divert attention and resources from the fundamental changes needed at the policy, corporate, and infrastructure levels.
This brings up an interesting question. If behavioral science has traditionally focused on nudging individuals towards better choices, what does this mean for the application of behavioral insights in climate action? Is it rendered less useful?
Not at all, but its application needs to shift dramatically. The report implies that behavioral science needs to pivot from primarily influencing individual consumers to influencing the decision-makers who control those larger systems. This means applying insights to policymakers, corporate executives, urban planners, and engineers.
So instead of nudging consumers to buy an electric car, it's about nudging city councils to invest in widespread EV charging infrastructure, or nudging automakers to phase out internal combustion engines entirely.
Exactly. Think about how defaults work. A classic nudge is making renewable energy the default option for households. But a more systemic application would be making renewable energy the default energy source for an entire grid through policy and investment, rather than relying on individual opt-ins. The report indicates that the leverage points for behavioral intervention move up the chain of influence.
That's a crucial distinction. It's about designing choices at a higher level, not just presenting better choices to the end user. What might that look like in practice?
Consider urban planning. Behavioral insights could be used to design cities that make sustainable transportation the most convenient and attractive option, rather than just asking individuals to cycle more. This involves things like zoning reforms that allow for mixed-use development, robust public transit systems, and safe pedestrian infrastructure. The default behavior is baked into the environment itself.
So the nudge isn't just about individual decisions at the point of choice, but about shaping the entire decision architecture. It's about changing the landscape of available choices, making the sustainable option effortless, or even the only option. And that's where the 70% figure becomes critical again.
To shift those emissions tied to infrastructure and supply chains, the behavioral interventions need to target the engineers designing the infrastructure, the politicians drafting the regulations, and the executives making procurement decisions for massive corporations. It's about shifting their defaults, their incentives, their information environments. This also sounds like it has implications for what is sometimes called nudge washing or greenwashing. If companies or governments emphasize individual responsibility, is that potentially a way to deflect from their own lack of systemic action?
That's a significant concern highlighted by this perspective. When the narrative disproportionately focuses on individual lifestyle changes, it can inadvertently create a convenient smokescreen for industries or governments that are lagging on systemic change. It shifts the burden of responsibility and, crucially, the cognitive load onto the consumer rather than the entities with the greatest capacity for large-scale impact. So it's not just that individual actions are insufficient, but that overemphasizing them can be actively counterproductive if it distracts from the real levers of change. Precisely. It risks demoralizing individuals when they realize their best efforts barely move the needle on a global scale, and it allows systemic actors to avoid accountability. The paper implicitly argues for a more honest and strategic deployment of behavioral science. But what about the argument that individual actions, while small in direct impact, can still create social norms, signal demand for change, and build political will? Does the 10% illusion perspective completely discount that? The analysis doesn't completely discount it. The report implicitly acknowledges that individual actions can play a crucial role in creating the social and political climate for systemic change. For instance, widespread adoption of certain behaviors can signal to policymakers that there's public support for more ambitious climate policies. It can also create a market demand for sustainable products and services, which then incentivizes companies to innovate. So it's not about the direct emissions reduction from an individual's bike ride, but the collective message that such actions, along with thousands of others, send to city planners about the need for better bike lanes and less car infrastructure. That's a more nuanced interpretation of individual agency in this context. The WRI's point is that it's important not to confuse that signaling and norm-setting power with directly closing the emissions gap. The latter requires systemic design. This really reframes the conversation around climate action. It moves from guilt-tripping individuals to empowering them to demand and participate in systemic change. And that's a key takeaway. The challenge is immense, and the science underscores that incremental individual behavioral changes, while personally meaningful, are not enough. The focus has to be on transforming the fundamental systems that drive emissions. So, to distill this down, what are the core insights listeners should really grasp from this 10% illusion idea? First, the scale of the climate challenge requires systemic solutions, not just individual behavior change. The vast majority of emissions are locked into our infrastructure and supply chains. Second, behavioral science remains critical, but its primary target needs to be policymakers, corporations, and systemic designers, not just the end consumer. And third, the overemphasis on individual choices can be a dangerous distraction, potentially allowing large emitters to avoid accountability and foster a sense of individual inadequacy. Exactly. And fourth, while direct emissions reductions from individual actions are limited, the collective signaling and norm-setting power of individual choices remains valuable for building political will and demand for systemic change. It's a contributing factor, not the main solution. This leaves one wondering then how such information is effectively communicated to the public without demotivating individual effort. And what responsibility do behavioral scientists have to articulate the limits of individual nudges when facing a problem of this magnitude? Those are indeed the crucial questions moving forward.
That's all for this episode of Incentives Matter. Join us next time as we keep unpacking what really drives decisions. Thanks for listening.
Choose wisely, or at least know why you didn't.